Well, thank you for being with us online on campus. I invite you to join me in God's Word in 1 Samuel chapter 23. We're taking one more look at Saul. And we're going to see the end of Saul's life by the time we get through with this. Today we're going to look at bitterness, because bitterness is something that we can struggle with. We really can. We can struggle with this sense of bitterness. And we're going to talk about how bitterness played a part in his life. Maybe you've been hurt. Whether it's real or you've imagined the hurt, it doesn't matter. Hurt still hurts. It's still an emotion that you feel. And if we allow that hurt to just overcome us, it can lead us down this pathway, specifically a pathway toward bitterness, especially if we don't deal with it properly. Now, if we don't deal with it properly, what happens? It takes root in our lives, and it will grow in the fertile soil that is our emotion and is our life. Every day when I go to work, I pass by the same house. I take basically the same trip I make every morning when I come to the office. And when I come and I leave the house, I drive by, and the same lady is out in her yard every day. And she is bent over, or she's on her knees, and she's in there, and she's digging out every weed that she can find in her yard. Every day she's doing this. And I look at her yard, and I look at my yard, and I'm like, if you ever get bored, you can come on over. You know, if you root out every weed in your yard, feel free to come on over, because I could use it. You know, I wish my yard looked as good as hers, and then I start to think, that means I'm going to have to do what she's doing. I'm not sure I want to do that. Let's just keep mowing, and maybe we'll get rid of it, you know. I'll just mow it a little lower this week. But that's the problem is I can mow every day if I want to. But if I don't actually dig down and pull the weed out by the root, and I've gone by and I've pulled, and I get a whole lot of it down to the ground, and I can even pull it where it's broken off under the soil. But you know what'll happen? It'll grow back. If I don't actually get that root, and I look at that root, and I verify I've got the root, that weed's growing back. You know what? The same thing is true with bitterness in our lives. This is why the author of Hebrews in Hebrews 12:15 says, let no root of bitterness spring up. Let no root of bitterness spring up, for it will defile many if you let it root. Don't even let it root up. Bitter people are angry people. If you ever want to self-assess, do I deal with bitterness in my life? Bitter people are angry people. Bitter people are negative people. Bitter people critique and criticize people more than they should. This is what bitterness does when it takes root and springs up in my life, that I become negative. Whatever I see negative. Whatever I see in that way. Or I criticize everything to the nth degree. And this is what happens if I deal and let bitterness rise up in my life, that I just become negative. Think about your life. Think about the words that you've used in the last week. Do they tend to be angry, negative, and critical? I understand. This is a time of our life right now where it can be easy, and I think it's a great temptation of the devil, that it's easy to be angry, negative, and critical right now. And we are being fed anger, negativity, and criticism. But my friends, we as Christians, if we're going to claim Christ, have to walk a different pathway. Certainly there are times when criticism is valuable, when we need to evaluate and criticize things in a way that's healthy and constructive. That's not what I'm talking about. But when we approach every relationship, every person, or every conversation with anger, negativity, or criticism, we are facing and dealing with bitterness that we need to root out of our life. We can't just mow it down by worshiping every week. I can't even pull it off at the soil by getting in God's word every day. I need to sit down, pull that sucker out, look at the root, and throw that away to make sure I get it completely out of my life. So when it says, let no root of bitterness spring up, this is what it's talking about. Weed it out down to the root. But what if you deal with bitterness? What if that is something that you are recognizing today that maybe you're dealing with? What do we do with that? Because in the series Pressure Cooker, that's what we're thinking is, we're in a pressure cooker of emotion, and pressure is rising and stress is rising. And in that moment, we can blow. And when we blow up, we get burned, we burn other people, and we can do that with bitterness. From bitter to better is just one letter. Are you working on the letter? What I find interesting is to go from bitter to better, you have to take the I out. When you want to remove bitterness from your life, you begin with removing the I. And you think about how we need to take ourselves out of this moment and begin to say, how would Jesus respond in this moment? Keith had a whole bunch of bracelets made up for a camp we didn't get to go to this year. And I know he's real sad about that. But it's WWJD. Now in the 80s, I knew what would Jesus do? I mean, that's 80s and 90s, man. We everything was WWJD. And then everybody made memes about it and made fun of it. But now, you come back and he's got 4 more letters on there. HWLF. Anybody know what that stands for? He would love first. When you want to think about bitterness, anger, negativity, criticism, what would Jesus do? He would love first. He would love first. Am I loving my neighbor? Am I loving God? Am I loving my neighbor? These are some basic questions that we ask. What we're going to find in Saul's life, and if you want to join me over at 1 Samuel 23, we're going to find Saul at the end of his life, he is bitter. He started out angry. He moved to envy and jealousy and fear. And now he is just bitter. He has let that root itself in his heart and in his life. He has let it grow. And I believe he has fed it. We're going to look at what it does to a person's life. And then we're going to talk about 3 ways for us to get rid of bitterness. So, in 1 Samuel 23, what we're going to find is that Saul has moved to this sense of bitterness. Because anytime somebody brings up the name David, I mean, he just dives deep into that. He's angry, negative, critical, moves straight into bitterness about David. Nobody bring up David. Let me ask you a question. You have anybody like that in your life? When their name is mentioned, all you do is go to negativity and anger and all these things. You're dealing with bitterness. We have to eradicate that from our lives. From the root, not from the leaf, not from the stem, but from the root. You might think you get away with it by cutting it off under the soil for maybe an extra week, but it's going to come back because you didn't actually get it out. We have to remove it all. And yes, I like to play golf, and there's 2 times a year that I absolutely hate to play golf. Now, that's a really strong statement for me. I love playing golf, except for 2 times a year. You know when that is? When they aerate the greens. And when they aerate the greens, what that means is they take a machine and they put holes all in the green. And the machine comes across and they pull out all these pellets, and they pull out about little plugs about that long and about an inch round, and they pull them all out. If I get anywhere near the green, I just count it as going in the hole, because it's useless to try to putt on that thing. Yes, when you go through your life and you root out bitterness, it will feel uncomfortable. It'll feel weird for a while, and you may not recognize yourself for a little while, but you know what happens to that green after about a week or 2 of watering and fertilizing properly? Is it fills in, and it's thicker, and it's more beautiful, and it's more playable, and it's a great thing. If you don't do that, the green will actually die over the course of time. If you don't root out the bitterness out of your life, you will emotionally die before long. And how sad would it be to be physically alive and emotionally dead? So these are important times, and this is an important process that we have to go through today. So, here in chapter 23, we find it was reported to David, look, the Philistines are fighting at Keilah and raiding the threshing floors. So David inquired, hey, what should I do? David always goes to God. A problem arises in his life, David goes to the Lord. We're going to find that again here in just a second. But if you look down in verse 7, let's check in with Saul and let's see what Saul is doing. Verse 7. When it was reported to Saul that David had gone to Keilah, he said, God has handed him over to me, for he's trapped himself by entering a town with barred gates. Now, when I read that and I think about Saul, this is how I picture Saul when the news comes to him. So Saul's sitting there, news comes to him, hey, David's over at Keilah. I got him! I got him! He's in a city with barred gates. He can't get out. I've got him. This is how I think David, because he's moved to such a depth of depravity that David is the anointed one of God. Saul knows it. David knows it. Everybody knows it. But somehow Saul thinks still that if I could just get rid of David, then we can all go back to what I want. Bitter to better is one letter, and it starts with removing the I. Saul's still about himself. Hey, if I could just get rid of this, hey, you know what? If I could just remove this from my life, then, hey, we can go back to what I want. Despite the consequences that God's already told me I'm going to have to face, if I could just do this, if I could just do that, if I could just get this job, if I could just get this friend out of my life, if I could just disrespect them enough and they leave, if I could just push them out, if I could just, whatever, I. Bitter to better is just one letter, and it starts with taking the I out. But Saul can't do that, and he doesn't do that. But he is giddy about this. Saul goes bitter, David goes better. Look what David does. Verse 9, when David learned that Saul was plotting evil against him, he said to the priest. So what's Saul do? Man, he's laughing it up. He's yucking it up. He's thinking, this is awesome. I've got him. What's David do? Let's pray about this. Let's see what God's going to do about this. What should I do? And so David goes to God. When he says he goes to the priest, bring out the ephod, that's what he means. He means we need to sit down and inquire of God. God, what should I do in this moment? It's not what do I want to do. God, what should I do? What do you want me to do? Then we move over just a few verses, and we see down at 19, look at this. Some Ziphites came up to Saul at Gibeah. So we're in a different spot. David's moved off to a different spot. And look what they say to Saul. David's hiding among us in the strongholds in Horesh on the hill of Hakilah south of Jeshimon. Now, whenever the king wants to come down, let him come down. Our part will be to hand him over to the king. May you be blessed by the Lord. Have you ever spiritualized your bitterness? Have you ever tried to justify, to rationalize the bitterness that maybe you have? Oh, be blessed by the Lord. Yes, you're doing the Lord's work by providing David to me so that I can kill him, so that I can try to avoid God's wrath and avoid God's consequence, so that I can somehow rationalize the sin in my life to do what I want to do, stay on the throne, and let my son come on the throne, even though God has already stated it wasn't going to happen. How messed up. But this is what we do, isn't it? This is what we do. This is how we handle things sometimes. And so they chase each other around the mountain. David goes one side of the mountain, Saul goes the other side of the mountain, and so they're just kind of chasing one another. But Saul is just letting bitterness run his life. And then you get into chapter 24, and this is a fascinating little moment right here. So Saul's chasing David, okay? And this is what happens. Saul, Mother Nature calls, and so Saul goes over to a cave to answer the call of Mother Nature. What he doesn't know is the cave he chooses, that's where David and his men are. So David and his men are in this cave hiding from Saul. Here comes Saul. Strolling into the cave, his men move back. David and his men move deeper into the cave, while Saul handles the business of the moment. You know what his men told David? Oh, here's your chance. David's like, no, I'm not going to do that. Saul went bitter. David went better. David does go up, cuts off a corner of his robe, doesn't harm Saul, but cuts off a corner of his robe. I don't understand how that can work and Saul not know what's going on. That's just me. I don't get it. You know, if you try to cut off my pant leg, I'm going to know what you're doing. You know what I'm saying? I'm going to recognize it. And I've tried to figure this out a little, and, just try to think it through. How in the world can this actually happen? How is this? Maybe this is a part of the tattered part of the robe that drags along the ground. It's frayed, and he just pulls off. I don't know. What I do know is that Saul goes bitter and David goes better, because Saul leaves, still trying to find David to kill him. David comes out and says, Saul, look, what is this? It's a part of your robe. I could have killed you with the same knife that I cut off a portion of your robe, but I did not. Why are you chasing me? Why is this going on? And as every addict will do, Saul was like, oh, I'm sorry, you're right, my fault, my bad, you're right, I'll never do it again, I understand. And then we go to chapter 26. The Ziphites, again, it's the Ziphites. The Ziphites came to Saul at Gibeah again. Hey, David's hiding on the hill again. So Saul, accompanied by 3,000 men, they chase him. And David, once again, they're sleeping. David walks into the camp, takes something from Saul, goes back up, calls out the next morning, hey, whose is this? They recognize that it's Saul's. And David again says, look, I could have killed you. I did not. Again, why are you chasing me? Why in the world would the king of Israel want to kill the next king of Israel? Well, politically, you could understand that, right? Personally, you could probably understand that. Well, he wants his son on the throne, not David. But it's because he has allowed bitterness to take root in him, to cause him to want to kill the thing of God. Just think about that. Saul dies in battle, a bitter man. The only thing I could think of worse would be for you to die emotionally now while you still breathe, because you've let bitterness so choke out every other thing in your life. Because that's what it does. It will choke you. It will choke you. It will control you. It will overwhelm you. Don't let the root of bitterness spring up, causing trouble, defiling many. So how do I get rid of bitterness? 3 things. Number 1, let God reveal it. Let God reveal it. This is, as a follower of Christ, you have the Spirit of God present in you because you took the time and made the decision in your life to recognize that you have done wrong and can't pay it back, that when Jesus died on the cross, was buried and rose again, completely took care of all of the requirements. You come before God and say, I have done wrong. I trust what Jesus did is sufficient for me. God, forgive me, lead my life. In that moment, it is all erased. You get to start over. And in that moment, the Spirit of God comes to be a part of your soul and a part of who you are. And you need to but it doesn't mean you're going to live perfectly. Doesn't mean you're going to do everything right. You need to ask the Spirit of God to reveal to you what it is that's going on. Reveal, what area do I have bitterness, God? Do I have it? Because you know what? Many of us, hey, I don't deal with that. I don't have bitterness. Jeremiah 17:9 says, your heart is so wicked and deceitful, you don't even know your own heart. You can think, oh, I'm not dealing with that. I'm so glad the preacher's preaching on that because I know 14 people that need to know this, but not me. Oh, it's way, boy, I don't see them. I hope they're online because, boy, they need to hear this one. Let me tell you, I had to hear this one when I wrote it. Until I took a moment and said, God revealed to me. I didn't realize that some of the betrayals of my life in recent years still weighed on me. You can't be free of that unless the Spirit removes it. You've got to let God reveal it first. You've got to be willing to say, I want to know. Because you have the freedom to choose. You have free will. That's a belief we have. That you have the freedom to make these decisions. God has complete ability, but gives all of us the freedom to choose. Do you realize we could actually say, I don't want to know? What's healthy is, God, test my heart and let me know, is there anything wrong in me? Is there any bitterness in me? And while you're doing that, you might as well go down the rest of the sermons we've talked about. Is there any anger in me? Is there any envy? Is there any jealousy? Is there any overwhelming fear? Is there any bitterness? God, reveal to me what I need to know. Not only reveal it to me, but explain to me. Explore my life. Explain to me in detail, what do I need to handle right now? You see, if you remember back when Jesus was washing the feet of the disciples, you remember what Peter said when he got to Peter? Peter was so proud. Peter's like, I don't need that, God. No, you're not going to wash my feet. And he didn't think Jesus should humble himself in that way. But I think there was a part of Peter that didn't understand that he needed it. He said, and Peter's like, no, I don't need that. And Jesus said, look, if I don't wash your feet, you don't have a part of me. Oh, well, wash all of me, Peter says. Not just my feet, but my head, my hands, everything. And Jesus says something very interesting right there. You remember what he says? This is what he says. A person that's been washed doesn't have to wash his whole body, just his feet. That which got dirty needs to be washed. And what that reminds me and tells me is this: I can be secure in my relationship with God and in my future in heaven, but it doesn't mean the joy that he wants me to experience now will be a reality for me if I have dirty feet. Because walking through my day, walking through my week, walking through my life, we sin, don't we? We can have moments of issue. And it may not be the outside, it may not be all of the sin everybody sees. The sins of commission are so easy. So we go before, oh, forgive me, God, for I thought that. Forgive me because I said that. Forgive me because I did this. God, forgive me for these things. But what about the things deeply residing in your heart that nobody sees, you rarely consider, and they're in the dark moments, the dark recesses of your heart? What about those things, like anger and bitterness and jealousy and envy? What about those things that are harder to put your finger on, but they're controlling your life? Those things that you need God, through the power of the Holy Spirit, to explore you, to explore in those dark corners of your heart. The body may be washed, but the feet are dirty. And 1 John 1:9, written to Christians, says this, that he is faithful and just to forgive us. If we confess our sin, he is faithful and just to forgive us and to remove all unrighteousness. That's not about salvation. It's about sanctification. It's not about that moment of faith, trust in what Jesus did. It is after that, when we have gone and done something, thought something, harbored something, let something spring up, that we come before God and we say, okay, I need you right now. Let God reveal it, so that grace can remove it. Let God reveal it in your life so that grace can be ushered in and can be removed. Let God cut it out or cut it down in your life and throw it off into the sea of forgiveness, never more to be seen, never more to be heard from again, unless we choose to try to go back and replant it. No, let me ask you something. This is just something to think about. If I have spent the time, now just think about this, walk with me a minute. If I've spent the time to go out into my yard with a shovel and to dig out down to the root the weeds that I don't want in my yard anymore, and I pull all of them up, I make sure I've got the root out, and I set it over on the driveway, and I go through my yard, and I spend the time to clean all that up, to get all that out of my life, what would you think of me if at that time I was like, whew, boy, I'm glad I got all those out of my life, and the next morning I'm out replanting them into the yard? You'd be like, dude, seriously? How different is it for us to one day say, God, explore my heart, explain my issues, receive the forgiveness of God. You've rooted it out, you've set it on the driveway of your soul, and it needs to be carted off to the dump. But you hold on to it, and you replant it the next day. That person comes back to mind. You're betrayed again. You have issue again. You're harmed again. You're hurt again. Somebody says something stupid again. Something posts something about you again. Somebody talks behind your back again. Somebody talks smack or trash about you, and you just and you've still got them, and you replant them. Let grace remove it. Let the grace of God not only reveal it, but remove it from your life. And finally, let good replace it. Let good replace it. Jesus told the story of a man who had a demon, and he referenced this as a demon in his house, and he cleansed his house, and he got the evil spirit out of his house. And then he sat back and was like, woo, boy, I'm so glad I got that out of my life. And you know what that spirit did? You remember what the story says? The spirit went and found some friends, and they came back, and they overtook him again. Only this time it was so much worse than it was before. Why? Because the guy cleaned his house but didn't replace it with good. I can take the trash out, but if I don't replace it with good, I'm leaving myself open to a problem again. Galatians 5 talks about the fruits of the flesh and the fruit of the Spirit. And you can evaluate and explain and enlighten yourself through the Spirit of God. You can be confessional and cleansing of all the things of that's expressed there in Galatians 5 of the fruit of the flesh. And you can have all of that removed. But if you don't actively replace it with the fruit of the Spirit, you're leaving yourself susceptible to a recurrence. If you don't put a barrier up to keep it from coming back, you've got to put the good in. Hebrews chapter 12, verse 14, the one before the one we've been looking at. Pursue peace with everyone and holiness. Without it, no one will see the Lord. Make sure no one falls short of the grace of God, and no root of bitterness springs up, causing trouble and defiling many. You've got to not only weed it out, but you need to fertilize the grass that's there to fill in what you just pulled out. Let God reveal it, let grace remove it, and let good replace it. This is the pathway to freedom from bitterness. This is how we root it out, how we get it out, and how we can then keep it out by letting the Spirit of God do the work necessary. Will you open your heart and your mind and your soul to letting God do the work He needs to do? From bitter to better is just one letter. The question is, are you working on it? Are you working on changing those letters? Are you working on switching those letters, as I think Lecrae says? What are you doing with it? Are you actually dealing with it? Maybe you're disenchanted. Maybe you've become tired of religion. Maybe you've let bitterness take root in your heart. It's time to remove it before you get burned.